Welcome to the GOBI webinar series and the third of our webinars that are being held over a period of 3 months. My name is David Johnson. I'm the coordinator of the Global Ocean Biodiversity Initiative, GOBI, based in the UK. And GOBI is a partnership of 45 scientific organisations. And as you can see, or you should be able to see from this slide, if it would advance, I don't need to do it. It essentially is organisations all over the world involved with biodiversity data, biodiversity methodologies, and supporting the Convention on Biological Diversity's EBSA process, the ecologically or biologically significant marine areas. And GOBI ICI is a series of research projects during the period from 2016 to 2021, funded by the German government. So this webinar series is really intended to showcase and share the 6 work packages that are part of this research. And you can find the previous recordings of the previous 2 webinars on the GOBI website. Today, as you can see with this slide, is all about seabirds, and that is courtesy of our partner BirdLife International. And BirdLife International, you may know very well, but is a global partnership in itself with over 8,000 staff and 5,000 volunteers, and has already defined over 1,000 important bird and biodiversity areas. And that's all about birds, their habitats, and global biodiversity. And we have 2 presentations, or 2 presenters today. The first is Dr. Maria Diaz, and the second is Dr. Tammy Davies. They're both marine science experts within BirdLife, coordinating seabird data and applying that to conservation issues. And as they'll explain, a lot of this uses the Seabird tracking database, but it also involves promotion and advocacy. And that's really important in terms of what we're doing with that work, bridging the scientific and policy divide. So I'll stop sharing my screen now and pass over to Maria to start up. Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much for the presentation. Can you see the slides?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so good afternoon or good morning or good evening, depending where you are. Thank you all for joining this webinar today. It is really a big pleasure to be here talking a bit about BirdLife work, especially under this ICI GOBI project that David mentioned. So today I will be presenting the work on behalf, I will be, along with Tammy, presenting the work on behalf of a wider team, of course, working more closely with this project. And I will start by talking a bit about BirdLife and what BirdLife is. And again, thanks David, you already explained a bit. BirdLife, it's not a single NGO, it is in fact a partnership of several NGOs that work together with the goal of conserving birds and the habitats of birds. And these partners, these more than 120 partners that we have in all regions, in many countries, are in fact fundamental to deliver our conservation work, and also together with the Secretariat to delineate strategies to conserve birds, but also the habitats and the wider biodiversity. BirdLife is the responsible for the classification of the red list, or to do the red list assessment for all birds in the world, not only seabirds, but all birds in the world. So we work closely with IUCN on classifying all bird species, and we are also heavily engaged in the KBA, the Key Biodiversity Area Initiative. We have 9 thematic conservation programs, and of course today I will be talking about the marine program, that is the work that we do to preserve the seabirds. The marine program was initially established in 1997 with the name of Global Seabird Program. Was in fact the first global program of BirdLife. At that time, and still nowadays, it is hosted by our BirdLife partner in the UK, that is the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. The work that I will be presenting today is mostly the work that we do in our marine science and policy teams. We are based in Cambridge, in the David Attenborough building, that is now, of course, closed, unfortunately. So you can see here the entire team working there, and also our PhD students, Martin and Marie, that are working closely with us also in the marine science team. So why seabirds, and why is BirdLife dedicating these efforts to preserve seabirds? Well, of course, we could say that because they are beautiful, charismatic, we all know that, we all share that admiration for species like albatrosses and penguins. Unfortunately, the reason is not that nice, and I think we all know also that seabirds are amongst the most threatened groups of vertebrates globally. And to illustrate that, I will tell maybe this story of these populations of albatrosses breeding in South Georgia, in the South Atlantic. And these species have been studied by a group of researchers from the British Antarctic Survey since a long time, and this shows also the importance of these long-term studies. And by the late 80s and 90s, they started noting a steep decline in the populations of these species. And these species, in fact, they tend to be very stable. They are long-lived species. The populations usually do not fluctuate a lot, but suddenly they start noting this decline on these species. Well, after years of research and collecting some evidence, just to show an image of what this means in terms of practical terms, this is an image of one of the colonies of the gray-headed albatross from Bird Island back in '79, and this is the same colony nowadays. So as you can see, it's quite obvious from these images that the populations are in fact declining a lot. So as I was saying, after researching a bit and trying to understand reasons for this decline, the researchers found out that basically what was happening is that these species, they usually forage at sea. They can cover very large distances when they go in these foraging trips. And in fact, what was happening is that they were being attracted by longliners, especially because they have the baited hooks, and so the albatrosses are attracted to that, and then they end up dying in what we call the bycatch, or the accidental capture of non-target species in fisheries. So now we know that bycatch is not only affecting albatrosses. In fact, in a study that BirdLife led and was published last year, we found out that 100 species of seabirds at least are somehow impacted by bycatch. And they belong to many different families. So again, it's not only a problem with albatrosses or shearwaters, it's a problem that affects many seabird families, sea ducks, gannets, many species. So you can see here some estimates of the numbers of birds that die every year in longline fisheries and gillnet fisheries that affect mostly more coastal species like sea ducks, and is in the order of hundreds of thousands of birds that die every year in this kind of with this kind of problem. On the other hand, it's not only bycatch. So in the same review that we did, we found out that many other threats are also impacting seabirds. Threats like invasive species on islands, so cats and rats that are accidentally or not introduced on islands, overfishing, climate change, hunting, disturbance. What is quite obvious is that seabirds are affected both by terrestrial and marine threats. because they depend on both environments. They need to nest inland in colonies, usually in islands, but also they depend on the marine environments to forage. They are suffering from both the impacts of humans in both environments, both terrestrial and marine environments. But of course, and well, as we all know, we that work more with marine systems, it's much more challenging to deal with problems and with threats in the marine environments. And with seabirds, that is especially true because they move a lot. So with the problems at the colonies, we can go to the colonies, we can try to eradicate the rats or cats or the invasive predators. But when they go out and forage, it's much more difficult to understand where the problem exactly is. It's a big unknown, or it was for a long time. So we were lucky enough that more or less at the same time, so we are talking about early 90s, there was a big increase in the use and studies using these tracking devices. So the tracking technology, so the use of GPS and geolocators, and I will not expand a lot on all these technologies, but the use of these kind of devices to track the movement of seabirds started to increase a lot during the 90s. Initially more, of course, with albatrosses and penguins that are heavier and could carry large devices that were, of course, the first ones. But with the advance of the technology, was possible to decrease the size of these kind of devices, and nowadays it's possible to track any kind of seabird species, even very small storm petrels like the one in this slide. So this kind of data is in fact absolutely fundamental to understand where the seabirds are going. And in this example we can see, and this came in fact to change completely the way we see seabirds and we see migration. Because it was possible for the first time to understand the large-scale movements of the species, like this albatross that is able to go all this circumnavigation around the southern oceans. So to understand where they spend more time and to understand the possible overlap with these kind of marine threats that they know they are suffering. And then even at a smaller scale, and this is another example, maybe contrasting, because it's a study with the coral shearwaters, a species that I've been working with since a long time. And this is in Madeira, in Portugal, and these are the let's say small scale movements. And of course, small scale, they are not so small, but they are small comparing with the large scale movements during a migration. But they can still travel a lot and go, for example, in this case, we know that thanks to this kind of technology, now we know that they rely a lot on the waters of the West African countries to forage. So a practical output or information or conservation output is to understand these linkages between countries and to understand that these West African countries are in fact very important for the population coming from Portugal. So recognizing the importance and the value of the tracking data for conservation, BirdLife decided to establish in 2003, initially as just a database in our computers, let's say, but to start establishing the seabird tracking database. So we started contacting researchers that were actively studying many seabird species in many colonies to start compiling all this data in a single database. With the idea was in fact to be able to see the big picture, to combine that information with also the information on the population sizes, and start understanding and compiling this data to understand where the problem was and it is, and where we should invest our time and address our conservation efforts. So nowadays we have 131 species in our seabird tracking database, and it's growing. We have more than 15 million positions. In this map you can see the evolution in terms of the colonies tracked of data that we have in the seabird tracking database. So we have now data from more than 360 different colonies globally. And this graph, you can see the evolution in terms of number of species, that is the blue line. So of course, a steep increase in the number of species and more even in the number of points or positions. and that was thanks to the development of GPSs. So as I was saying before, first we started with albatrosses and shearwaters, but then we soon we opened the database for many other families of seabirds, and now we have data for a wide diversity of species, which is really good because we can in fact again see that big picture of seabird conservation. Something that is absolutely fundamental in this project is the collaboration of many seabird researchers, and that I think was amazing to see how the community of researchers joined BirdLife in this effort. They share the data with us, they collaborate with us in many project studies, so they see an added value of having this data together. And in many cases they do the initial studies with a different purpose, or ecology study or behavioral, but then they see a second life and the recognition that this data is also very important for conservation. So that since the very beginning, we have been very well received by the research community, and so we are very happy to see that and to believe that this is really a big collaboration of researchers to deliver conservation. But of course, much more important than the number of species or number of points is what do we do with the data, and that what is our conservation outputs. And for that, I will give the floor to Tammy. Tammy will explain all the kind of things that we do with this tracking data. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. Perhaps just before you start, Tammy, I just remind people that we welcome your questions in the Q&A, and just so we don't lose touch of it, just before Tammy starts, there are 3 questions from Yogesh Kumar. Thank you very much, Yogesh, but directed toward Maria's presentation. So Maria, Yogesh asks, really, in terms of, and I think this refers to the albatross that you were talking about, which schedule of CITES are those species aligned to? I think you went on to explain the level of migratory activity. That was the second question, and then there was a question about global warming and how that's impacting on your work.
Would you mind if I reply to these in the end, just because Tammy will touch in some of these points, and so maybe
okay.
Would you mind? So in the end, we can maybe have a broad discussion if you don't mind.
Absolutely, yeah. Tammy, go ahead. Okay. And also feel welcome, Maria, perhaps to comment back in the Q&A as well.
Okay, thank you, David.
Tammy, please go ahead. Sorry to delaying you.
No worries. Thank you, Maria and David. So yeah, so Maria's talked a bit about the tracking data and our database. So I really wanted to talk about how our seabird tracking data underpins much of the marine conservation work that we do. So in collaboration with researchers, we've developed a method to identify important congregations from tracking data. We had a paper published by Ben Lascelles and colleagues in 2016, which detailed this. And more recently, we have a new R package called Track to KBA, which is now available on GitHub. We've then applied this method for conservation. And as Maria mentioned, one of our main programs of work is site-based conservation and focuses on identifying important bird and biodiversity areas, and then we advocate for their protection. So important bird and biodiversity areas, or IBAs as we refer to them, are globally important sites, and they're identified on a base of a set of standardized criteria. This program started back in the 1970s, and there are now more than 13,000 IBAs identified worldwide, and there is in all habitats in all countries. IBAs are the largest global network of sites of significance for biodiversity. And it was actually the success of this approach which led to the development of similar methods of different taxa, so including important plant areas and important marine mammal areas, or IMAs, which were the focus of the first GOBI webinar a few weeks ago. And there's also now a harmonized approach across all taxa called key biodiversity areas, and this is led by a partnership of NGOs, of which BirdLife is part of the Secretariat. So taking the IBA concept into the marine realm occurred much later, in around the early 2000s. And we've actually identified around 5,000 marine and seabird IBAs globally, and around 2,000 of these can be classed as truly marine sites. And we have IBAs identified in all ocean basins, both near shore and in the open ocean of the high seas. So when I say truly marine, it's because IBAs can actually have quite different types, particularly for seabirds. So we can have the seabird colony, which is actually a terrestrial IBA because seabirds breed on land. A different type of marine IBA would be the seaward extension. So this would be identified using a foraging range of the seabird. And then we can have the pelagic area. So this can be in the middle of the ocean. And this is identified from tracking data using the methods I mentioned from Ben Lascelles and colleagues, or the Tractor KBA package. But for all of these sites, they must meet the IBA criteria. And for marine sites, that means they must hold a population of globally threatened species, or more than 1% of the global population of the species. So we have all these sites, but what do we do with them? Well, a huge part of the work of our policy team, and in particular Carolina, who's on the panel in the call here, is ensuring that IBAs are recognised as important sites within international policy mechanisms. So such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, who are leading a process that David mentioned at the start to identify ecologically or biologically significant marine areas, more easily referred to as EBSAs. We've been feeding IBAs into this process. The advantage of seabirds for the marine realm is that they're one of the best studied migratory marine species. Their distributions often overlap with other taxa, and they can be an indicator for biodiversity hotspots. So we have more than 600 marine IBAs have been included within EBSA descriptions. And actually some EBSAs have been described based entirely on the IBA. For example, the Clipperton Fracture Zone petrel foraging area is both an EBSA and an IBA of the same catchy name, and it's a key non-breeding foraging area for pie-crossed petrel, which is a threatened seabird that breeds in northern New Zealand. But then at a more local or national scale, as BirdLife is a global partnership, we support our in-country partners to advocate for the protection of sites. So within Europe, this is actually really strengthened because the IBA criteria closely match that of the European legislation for special protected areas, which comes under the European Union directive.
Cami, so sorry to interrupt you. People are asking, could you please switch to full presentation mode?
Oh, is it not in full presentation mode?
No, sorry to interrupt you.
No problem. Is that better?
Absolutely, thanks.
Okay, no problem. So yeah, so here we have, you can see on this slide, an example from Malta. And this BirdLife Malta identified marine IBAs for their seabirds. And these IBAs are of global importance because Malta is home to 10% of the world's Yolkilon shearwaters and 50% of the Mediterranean subspecies of European storm petrels. And it was the identification of these marine IBAs that led to the first marine special protected areas for Malta. Outside of countries' jurisdictions in international waters of open ocean, which are also known as the high seas, we've also identified marine IBAs. But this area is a lot more challenging to work in because there's currently a lack of an overarching governance framework that regulates all activities within the area. However, the Northeast Atlantic has an advantage because there's the OSPAR Convention, and these have taken on the mandate to manage the high seas within the area. So the OSPAR Convention is a mechanism by which 15 governments and the European Union cooperate to protect the marine environment of the Northeast Atlantic. And we have an IBA, which is currently being considered as a marine protected area. And this is known as the North Atlantic Current and Evelynov Seamount, or NACES MPA. And this site was identified through analysis of tracking data. And you can see it marked on the map with a big red square. And you're probably thinking that site is in the middle of nowhere. How did you find it? Well, the IBA and the subsequent MPA proposal came about because there were indications that this was a really important area for seabirds from single species tracking studies. You can see a few examples of species here, and they're all kind of congregating in a similar area in the North Atlantic. So through a collaborative effort, including data that was shared by 66 different researchers, a comprehensive data set for seabird populations in the Atlantic was compiled, and this totaled more than 2,000 tracks from 23 species, 105 colonies across 16 countries. And the final site is a major hotspot for foraging seabirds in the North Atlantic. We've got 21 species using it and an estimated 5 million adult birds using the site throughout the year. And birds are traveling to this site from both the North and the South Atlantic. So it can really be considered one of the most important concentrations of migratory seabirds in the Atlantic. And it's truly incredible. The most abundant species was using the site was the little auk, so the little guy at the top there, with an estimated more than 2 million birds using the site during winter, and these guys are tracked from Greenland. We also have the South Polar skewers, sooty shearwaters, and great shearwaters, and these are migrating up to 13,000 kilometers from the southern hemisphere to spend some of the austral winter at the site. Then we have everyone's favorite seabird, the Atlantic puffin, with 1 million individuals estimated to be using the site, and these have been tracked from Iceland, the UK, and Ireland. And that's just a few of the species. Like we see, we've got evidence for 21 species using this site, and some of the numbers are really incredible, just noted on the slide here. If this site was designated, it would be the first high seas MPA identified from seabird tracking data. As I kind of outlined, it will be a very important site of migratory connectivity, and it's also important because it's the non-breeding distribution of seabirds, and this is a part of their life cycle that's really currently poorly protected globally. We're really hopeful that this site will be designated next year, 2021, so please do watch this space for any news updates on that. And now I want to go a bit beyond site-based approaches, because tracking data can also be really useful for a broader scale understanding and actions. So at the minute we have a new project, and this is funded by the Cambridge Conservation Initiative to investigate plastic pollution and pelagic seabirds. And because although there's a lot of attention to plastics, particularly in the media at the minute, there's actually little evidence at this stage for it causing population level impacts on seabirds. So this study aims to build a basis for future research and start to get a bit more of an understanding of this problem. So we're focused on petrels because their feeding habitats likely put them at greater risk of ingesting plastic. And we're looking at all species of petrels except for the really giant one, giant petrels. And we have tracking data for 76 species. And this includes Procellaria petrels, fulmars, as well as the cute little storm petrels, which are pictured below. And then we're overlaying seasonal species distributions with a model of plastic distribution to evaluate the risk of the species encountering different marine plastic. This project is currently underway, and we hope to have some news towards like the middle of next year. We can also use tracking data to model projected change to threats such as climate change. For this study, we used a mathematical model that simulates migratory movements based on attraction to resources, which here we used a proxy just as chlorophyll, and wind, so wind patterns, to predict how climate change might affect the large-scale distributions of non-breeding albatrosses in the southern Indian Ocean. So what we did here was we categorized the albatross species by their size and colony location, so whether they're large or medium or small, and then the colony, and simulated migratory movements for 3-month periods during the non-breeding. This is because they're not tied to the colony at this stage, so they move a bit freer. And actually, we found very minimal change for non-breeding movements and distribution between the present and the end of the century. The figure's a bit hard to see, so I'll just show it you in a bit more detail here. This is for the Amsterdam albatross, which is the larger albatross, and we did find a stronger effect for climate change here, possibly because they're bigger, so they're more likely to be impacted by changes in wind. And our model predicts that at the end of the century, this species will tend to migrate further eastwards towards New Zealand than it currently does, and its non-breeding distribution might shift slightly poleward. We then looked at the overlap of these non-breeding distributions of these albatrosses with the tuna regional fisheries management organisations, and actually we found that the overlap is largely similar from today compared to the future. And this means that the current seabird management measures that are in place, that are implemented through these regional fisheries management organisations, will continue to be important over the next 100 years. And I just want to say, because I think it's important to point out here, that we looked at the broad scale regional fisheries management organisations, or RFMOs, rather than fishing effort itself, because these results are only intended really to be interpreted at a large scale in terms of movement patterns. And as Maria mentioned at the beginning, bycatch is a really large threat to seabirds, but tracking data can provide critical information here too for assessing the overlap of seabird populations and fishing effort. And we recently published a paper in the Journal of Applied Ecology that combined tracking, demographic and chronological data from all major life history stages to estimate robust density distributions of whole seabird populations. So studying the movements of juvenile, immature and non-breeding adults is particularly challenging because during these life history stages, they spend really long times at sea and they only return to the colonies for really short periods of time, which makes retrieving the devices difficult. So there's generally a bit less data on these available than other life history stages. But we looked at the overlap with fisheries as an example of examining how neglecting particular life history stages can lead to errors in estimating risk. And we found it was really important to include all life history stages because adult-only distributions underestimated fisheries bycatch risk by up to 42%. And as you can see on this map of the Tristan albatross, the juveniles, which are shown in blue, like typical teenagers, they like to do their own thing, and they have very different distributions, and they overlap with a higher level of fishing effort. So like I mentioned, there's a lot less tracking of juvenile birds, but this information is really important to collect. And the codes and the methods used for this work are open access. And we'd be delighted to see this framework applied to other marine megafauna and also to different marine threats. And with this information on seabird distributions, we're able to use it to work with governments, with the regional fisheries management organisations, to implement or improve regulations, to target bycatch mitigation measures, and to introduce observer programmes to monitor compliance. So we do work via the Albatross Task Force on board vessels, providing training in bycatch mitigation measures and showing fishing crews how to safely handle seabirds. So a lot more of this work is done by the RSPB section of our team. But the bycatch mitigation measures we promote are inexpensive activities that are highly effective in preventing unintentional deaths in longline and trawl fisheries. And these include bird scaring lines, which are basically colourful streamers that are towed behind fishing vessels to scare the birds away. Night setting, since most seabird species don't actively forage in the dark, this can significantly reduce bycatch. And line weighting, which is just adding weights to the long lines to make the baited hooks sink quicker once they're deployed. And actually the regional fisheries management organisations for tuna now mandate that longline vessels use 2 out of the 3 bycatch mitigation measures when they're fishing below a 25-degree latitude. And we're also working with other researchers and organisations to develop innovative bycatch mitigation measures. There's the hook pod, which is a standalone measure to reduce longline bycatch and the sea uptake in New Zealand. And we're also working on trialling different methods to reduce bycatch in gill nets. So with all these efforts, I would love to be able to tell you that seabird populations are recovering. However, sadly, that is just not the case. And perhaps this is because they spend much of the time in the high seas and are still facing numerous threats when they're there and also on land. And perhaps also because they're long-lived species, so any population improvements take a long time to show. But I don't want to end on a downer, and there are lots of good news stories out there. So just want to share a few reasons to be optimistic. All 5 tuna RFMOs now require seabird bycatch mitigation measures to be used. In 8 out of the 10 bycatch hotspots, new regulations to protect seabirds have been introduced. The South African hake trawl fishery reduced the number of albatross killed by 99% after introducing mitigation measures. We're collaborating with MECO, who we heard about in the last GOBI webinar. And this is a platform to bring together data for many different types of taxa to help improve policy outcomes for migratory marine species. And we're also gathering new types of data, which helps us to further understand and address problems such as radar data, which can provide information on how and where birds are interacting with fishing vessels. And the final bit of conservation optimism is, as Maria said, the number of people who have shared the data and contributed to this work. It wouldn't have been possible without being a collaborative effort. So I'd also just like to say a massive thank you to all our data contributors to the Seabird tracking database. And of course to our funders who have supported this work, and in particular to ICI and the Global Ocean Biodiversity Initiative for their support in organising these webinars. Thank you.
Brilliant. Tammy, thank you so much. Thank you both. I can understand now why Maria wanted to reserve questions till now, because you did cover issues to do with global warming. But Yogesh Kumar has come back with another question as well, wanting to know whether there are any programs in Asia. So maybe you could answer that one first.
Tammy, do you want me to answer, or you want
me to go ahead? Yeah.
Well, yes. As I was mentioning in the beginning, we work globally via our BirdLife partners. We have several BirdLife partners, and many of them in Asia are in fact heavily involved in work in the marine systems and with Seabird. So we don't have a separate program in Asia, but we do have several partners in Asia working also with seabirds and the marine environment.
Thanks. And Yogesh also asked about CITES schedules. Could you just say a few words about that, please? I
will leave that to Carolina, that is our marine policy coordinator. I'm sure that she will be able to give a better reply.
Great. Carolina, go ahead, please. Yes. Carolina is the interface between science and policy. So Carolina, please.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, morning, and evening. Yes, I've responded just to inform to those watching us that I've also written the response on the chat. So if you want to record, that is on the chat. But to share here that CITES is the international convention that leads with trades of fauna and fauna. And indeed, there are very few seabirds that are included in the CITES appendices, which means how trade should or should not happen. And one albatross petrel, but there is one albatross listed where trade is prohibited, and some penguins where trade is either prohibited or needs to be controlled. So yeah, I would invite those to read the answer. And just to add that we need to understand a bit more birds or bird parts trade, seabirds in this case, because this is an area that it's not fully or enough well known by the scientific community as yet. We know some species, but seabirds, we need more investigation in this.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Probably one for Maria again. Please could you describe how other researchers can contribute to the Seabird database?
It's very easy. You just have to open an account. So write an email to us. It is in the Seabird tracking database website. Open an account, and then you can do everything online. You can just upload your data online. It will. And then important to say that the data in the Seabird tracking database is still owned by the data owner. So BirdLife or no one can use that data without the permission of the owner of the data. And that way we are also promoting the collaborative studies between researchers, and that is an important part of our Seabird tracking database that I didn't mention, but is also a platform for researchers to know what is out there, to get in contact with each other and to promote scientific collaboration. So it is possible to upload the data directly using our website. Choose the visibility of the data, because we know that sometimes the data is not yet published, so the owners don't want to show the details, and it's perfectly fine. So it can be just metadata level, for example, but it's still the information that the data exists. So again, it can be seen by other researchers to promote collaboration. So it's very easy. It's just to go to our web page, ask for a new account, and then everything is explained there, how to upload the data.
Thanks. A couple of questions from Hannah Wood. Thank you, Hannah. The first is about interaction with plastics. Are you using the global Seabird database to create risk maps for plastic interaction globally? And she also asks whether there is somewhere where people can read more about this work? Tammy, maybe.
I think actually Maria's best to talk a bit more about the plastic one, but I can add a link to the answer about the plastics page in the chat, so Hannah can read a bit more about that one there.
So yes, exactly what we are doing. So in that review that we did on the threats to seabird species, and maybe a surprise was to see that plastics is not as big as we thought that would be, because it's a very visible issue. Everyone is talking about plastics, and we found little evidence that the plastic is causing population declines, let's say. But we also noted that there's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of species that are likely exposed to a lot of plastic, but they are not very well studied. So we decided to establish a collaboration with the British Antarctic Survey, with the University of Cambridge, with FFI, Fauna and Flora International, to bring a bit more light into this issue and understand the risk of encountering plastic, especially by small petrels, because small petrels and storm petrels, gadfly petrels, that is the genus Pterodroma, they forage a lot in the middle of the oceans where plastic accumulates as well. And again, these species are much less studied than compared with many albatrosses, for example. So we decided to start this study first to just understand the risk of overlap with plastic. So we have, someone that is also attending this webinar. Beth is leading that project, and we invite Hannah, if you want to know a bit more, just write us an email to me or to anyone in our team in BirdLife, and we are happy to share a bit more about this project. We are kind of in the middle of the project, I think, finalizing the data analysis, and there's also a component after of policy and advocating for conservation in key areas that we are finding that are hotspots of plastic encounter.
Cool. A question, how optimistic are you that we can turn around the declines we are seeing in seabird species?
Maybe for Tammy, she was the one with the optimistic slide.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to be optimistic, otherwise we wouldn't still be doing what we're doing. But as I mentioned, we have seen some wins, and it's those that kind of keep you motivated to keep working. So it's nice, to see that, and just gotta, keep moving forward and working towards it. But I think it can be if everyone joins together.
Yeah, if I can add something, I mean, in many of these problems, in fact, we know the solutions. We know how to solve bycatch. The difficult thing is then, and for example, bycatch is a good example, and I think we are doing the albatross task force, and mostly our colleagues in the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, in fact, are doing an incredible work with bycatch. The bycatch, of course, the fishermen, they don't want seabirds to be bycaught as well, because one albatross in the hook is one less fish in the hook. So, of course, we are trying to find solutions that are both useful for the seabirds and also, of course, for fishermen, and to work together with them. And that is an essential part of our work. And that's why I think we've been successful. It's still, of course, a long way to go. But precisely because we found the solutions, or we know many of the solutions, now is time and funds to put them in practice. And apart from climate change, that of course is another level, but even climate change, is important to say that most of species that are affected by climate change, they are also affected by many other threats for which we know the solution. So we can build resilience, let's say, on seabird species by addressing these other problems that we know the solutions, like again bycatch and the invasive species on islands that are the most important ones. So we are optimistic, but there's a lot of work to do.
Okay, questions coming thick and fast. Thank you for those. Ben Porter asks, how would you envisage remote protected areas such as NACES to be enforced? What measures could be brought into effect to make such areas that are not subject to intensive fisheries or at risk of having bycatch issues?
Yeah, I'll take the NACES one. I think it is really tricky with these remote areas, especially to make sure that they are enforced, because they're so far away. They can often be out of sight, kind of out of mind. With NACES itself, because it comes within the OSPAR, any measures there would have to be done as sort of like a cooperative agreement with any other industries operating in the site. At the minute, the site is not subject to intensive fisheries, and we don't really have any understanding of the bycatch happening within that kind of area or in the North Atlantic. So that's an area that would be useful for further research, so we can understand better this kind of problem. But there are also lots of new types of data coming up all the time. So you are able to see where ships are, what they're doing, and I think much more remote surveillance will be the way that these sites in the middle of the ocean end up being monitored for compliance going forward.
Okay, one from Ben Khan. For tropical seabirds that are less migratory, gannets, terns, frigates, in the Indo-Pacific, for example, are the threats similar to birds foraging in cold water, or is this a different mix?
I can try to reply to that one. They are maybe the problems like harvesting. I mean, it's something that we saw in our global review, in fact, is that many of the issues that I mentioned are global issues. So also tropical species more in temperate regions. If we see the 5 top threats to seabirds are always the same, and they include bycatch, invasive species on islands, maybe a bit more in tropical environments, harvesting, but again, not an exclusive problem. Well, we have lots of species in more the Arctic and subarctic regions also affected by harvesting and hunting. But yeah, I would say that in general they are the same. That there are very common problems, and maybe flag again invasive species on islands. That is a global problem that is affecting almost half of the seabird species. So yeah, unfortunately, they are subjected to the same threats.
Okay, a question now on light pollution from T. Militao. Do you believe light pollution at sea may be a problem for seabirds with more nocturnal behavior, like always petrels or gadfly petrels? Is there a current study anywhere to evaluate this possible threat?
Yes, I do. I do believe there are some initiatives, some studies starting to try to understand a bit better this problem. That is a very good question. Yeah, it is likely an issue. Again, because these species are very difficult to study. They are highly nocturnal. It's really hard, and they are small. So just recently that we had the technology to understand the movements, and they move a lot. They are incredible compared even with albatrosses, that they are able to cross almost half an ocean to go in a foraging trip during incubation. So they are in fact able to cover incredible distances. And we know very little about interaction of these species with sources of light pollution. But that is something that is now starting to be more understood. In terrestrial ecosystems, we know that they are attracted by light. What happens at sea is still a mystery, but is something that agree that should be more studied.
Thank you, Maria. Another one here, which thank you to the questioner for linking back to the previous webinars. But the question mentions the different methods that have been used in terms of seabird data for conservation with respect to movement. And in terms of connectivity, are there any tools out there that guide practitioners through all these methods and how they can use movement data to achieve conservation outcomes?
Tammy, do you want to go for that one? Or?
I'll go first on this one. So I guess, yeah, there's lots of different approaches because the data often tends to have different needs to be able to translate it into outcomes. So we do have the Track to KBA package, which talks through, that's available on GitHub. And that does talk through how to use tracking data to get work through to identify sites that are useful for conservation. So this has been used on seabirds, turtles, and marine mammals. So you can take a look at that. And I think then also in terms of conservation outcomes, the MECO platform, which was the GOBI webinar last time, not necessarily taking the methods, but showing the different taxa and the different migratory connectivity and showing the linkages and how this can be used for conservation, I think is really important. Yeah, and I should say that we're also hoping to make our methods a bit more explainable, so we're hoping to also make a toolkit on this too.
Brilliant. Yogesh Kumar has come back again with a question about whether there are any programs within CMS for seabirds. Carolina, maybe.
Yeah, thanks David and Yogesh for sending these questions. Yes, again, just to share with others that I've shared this information on the written box, but to say that the CMS, the Convention on Migratory Species, is one of those other intergovernmental agreements that looks at conserving and protecting biodiversity. And yes, indeed, there is one agreement under CMS, which is the ACAP agreement for the conservation of albatross and petrel, which is one of these examples where there is one agreement to look at a specific group of birds under the CMS, under the framework, and it's looking at protecting these groups and has a particular focus on the issue of bycatch. It goes beyond, but it's particularly looking at the bycatch, how to address and mitigate.
Brilliant.
Yes.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Marta Cruz Flores for highlighting conferences about light pollution organized by SEO BirdLife and SPEA. That's great. I wanted to ask one, please. There's such a rush of questions, I have to barge in with my own. The NACES proposal, what sort of kickback have you had? What sort of barriers have you had? Tammy explained the compelling data picture, but what are the issues that OSPAR is discussing?
So I guess at the start, it was communicating the importance of the site from tracking data, and just, yeah, because the site's so far away and the data is remote, like people haven't necessarily seen the birds there themselves. It's then explaining what this data does and how the analysis works. So that's always, I think, a bit of a challenge for non-specialists. And then moving forward, it's faced well, not really challenges, but just different steps, I guess, looking at the different boundaries. How do you define the important boundary within OSPAR? Can the MPA overlap existing MPAs or not? And then what about extended continental shelf claims? Should the MPA overlap these or not? So similar kind of issues that have been faced by other marine protected areas that have gone through OSPAR as well, because they do already have some high seas MPAs. So this will just be one of the latest ones to their collection. And then the more recent issue is whether the seafloor should be included within the proposal or not, because there isn't really any direct evidence for the seabirds using the seafloor, yet we do know that the whole ecosystem is linked in terms of food webs. It's just very difficult to demonstrate it for these deep areas.
Talking of exciting MPA developments, or marine protection zone in this case, Tristan da Cunha's been in the news. How important, I guess it is from the slide you showed, Tammy, but how important is that area for migrating seabirds?
Maria?
Yeah, me? Okay. Yeah, no, those were wonderful news. Tristan da Cunha is an extremely important area for many seabird species, a hotspot of endemic seabird species there. Unfortunately, I've never been there, but I would love to. So yeah, excellent news, excellent news. Tristan da Cunha hosts one of the most endangered species of penguins in the world, that is the northern rockhopper penguin. The population suffered a big decline after an oil spill near one of the islands. So it's really good. Great news that we see that marine protected area being created, because the community of seabirds there is really important.
Thanks so much.
Just to add, sorry, David, because I mean, some of these species, in fact, and we've done a study precisely on the community of seabirds from Tristan da Cunha. Of course, the waters around Tristan da Cunha are extremely important, but also to flag that many of these species, even these endemic species like the Tristan albatross and the Atlantic yellow-nosed albatross, they travel a lot. So they are able to go to the African coast during an incubation trip and to come back. So just to flag again that they are extremely good news, but of course to protect these wide range species, it's not enough just to protect the waters around the colonies. We need to see the big picture where they are going. And again, this links a bit with the micro work with the connectivity between countries and the importance of finding a network of sites because they move a lot, so it's important to take that into account.
Yeah, important. Thank you. 2 more questions from Yogesh. Thanks, Yogesh. Keep them coming. Can we use remote sensing? Can we use satellites for detecting seabirds? And are there any issues with air traffic? I guess things like bird strikes against seabirds.
Replying to the satellite, we can penguin colonies, and we do have some recent studies really exciting showing new colonies completely previously unknown of penguins in Antarctica found with the satellite images. I mean, we can not individual birds, so maybe we can with very high resolution. Still, it's difficult, but certainly we can use satellite images to improve the way that we monitor populations, for example, and understand the evolution, especially in very remote areas like Antarctica, where it's very difficult to go there and count penguins. So yeah, to reply to that first question, yes. The second one, I don't... Avian traffic affecting seabirds, more coastal seabirds, yeah, it is possible. Well, in fact, that is a subject that is very close to me because now, well, I live in Lisbon, and there's a planned new airport in Lisbon to be built in the middle of one of the most important wetlands. That is also important for some seabird species, but more coastal species like gulls and terns. So there is a risk of strike, but yeah, it's not. I would say that is not such a risk in terms of the population declines of these species. It's more the disturbance that can cause an airport near an important site, an important colony, and of course it's a risk for the plane and the people that go inside that plane. That of course it's not nice to have a flock of gulls entering in your plane. But again, it's not that an issue in terms of population declines, no, but can be of course a risk in terms of disturbance and for the security of the passengers, let's say.
You mentioned Malta in your presentation, and I just wondered how receptive have the authorities in Malta been? Malta hasn't always had the best of records with birds in general, so how acceptable has this data been in Malta?
Tammy, you mentioned Malta.
I did. I did, but just Carolina, do you want to answer that one?
I think I'll need to be very honest here and say that I'm aware of the issues that the conservationist and our BirdLife partner faces in Malta. It's been very challenging to protect birds there. But having said that, I don't have particularly following the developments of the protection of those areas that have been designated. So I'll own you this answer to be more precise, but I can imagine, to be honest with you, but I can imagine that our colleagues in Malta are having lots of work. That's where I can, as much as I can say, David, because in fact, the national conservation actions and national policies are basically led by our national partners. So we do provide input with the data science and policy as well, but it's not as intense. And in this particular case, I've not been following that as much. But I'm happy to follow up with that one to see what are the big challenges they are facing.
Thank you so much. I just want to amplify another question by Yogesh, really, which is about fisheries impacts, and really just to ask you whether the bycatch mitigation methods that you outlined work. You know, you talked about scaring and night setting and line weighting. Do they work? And if so, which is the best one? And or are they in a combination? Perhaps a bit more information on that.
Want me to well, they do work. I mean, Tammy can complement that. They do work, and basically these measures, in fact, they are the result of years of study, understanding precisely which measures could work that would not also affect the fisheries that much in terms of decreasing the catches, because of course we have to work together with fishermen, so to convince them to implement these, and if these measures would somehow decrease the efficiency of the fisheries, of course, would be much more difficult. But they do work, especially in combination. What we saw is we have kind of three major measures, as Tammy was saying. If we implement two, the bycatch risk decreases a lot. So two out of three would be enough to decrease the bycatch risk considerably. Of course, that depends a lot on the region, the type of and here we are talking about especially the bycatch of albatrosses and shearwaters. If we talk more about gillnets and the bycatch of sea ducks, it's much more difficult to find measures that are efficient, and that is something that we are also actively working on, is finding practical solutions to implement in that case. But yeah, but those measures that Tammy was talking about, they do work, and that's how we managed to reduce a lot the bycatch, for example, in South African waters, but precisely by implementing these kind of measures. So they really work.
And yeah, can I just add, because I think that numbers are very interesting. And in South Africa, the example that Maria just shared now, the reduction of bycatch was up over 95% in one specific type of fisheries, which is quite, I think is quite significant and encouraging. That links to what Tammy said. We need to be positive because there are some wins there.
Still muted, so. But anyway, brilliant. Back to optimism, which is where we want to be. Unfortunately, I've really enjoyed all of this, but let me just check. Yes, one more question from Miriam Lerma. With so many areas being important for seabirds, many species under threat, and with different threats to seabirds, how do you decide where to put your attention? Where does the priority go?
That is a very good question. It's not easy. We do have, I mean, that's, we are lucky to have this partnership, and that helps us a lot, because we work with partners all over the world. We are able to collect information, and of course understand where we can put our effort that will also return some practical results. That is, I think, the key issue. Understand a bit, of course, the niche and what the others are doing and where we can make a difference. That is absolutely fundamental. But also taking into account the partnership that we have, where we can in fact act in a more efficient way, because we have a partner there, because the partner is active in marine conservation. So basically we take into account all these variables, where not only the species that are threatened, but also what can we do that in fact will make a difference in the end. That is our main focus, is to have a practical consequence in terms of the conservation status of the seabird species.
Thanks. I've got a comment in the chat from Martin, who points to a LIFE project. You can read it there about Bycatch. So thanks, Martin, for that clarification. One last question then. Could you explain more if seabird tracking data is being used to inform discussions about the international legally binding instrument for the high seas, which is being considered by the Intergovernmental Conference? Carolina, I guess this is coming.
Yes. Yes, I was just writing the answer on the text, so you you caught me there. So indeed, that's a very good question. So as you know, the treaty, the High Seas Treaty, is being negotiated at this very moment, and that, as is the treaty text, the main treaty text, it's very high level provisions. So it's not that we are getting into the details yet of the groups that the treaty will indirectly address. But what we do as BirdLife, we engage with other NGOs and we build policy positions so that the governments can take the better decisions when they are deciding on this wording of the text. And the seabirds tracking data, of course, is very important, because then we can understand the use of these high seas by the seabirds, as Maria and Tammy showed. We know that they spend quite some of their time in the high seas, very frequent to fish and the migratory routes. So we understand the importance of the high seas, and then we can, with that data, we can reflect that on what the treaty text may contain to, in the future, address the conservation issues of these seabirds. So in summary, it does, but indirectly at this stage.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed the presentations. Thank you for all of the answers as well. I have to draw us to a close now. We're running against time. But before we close out, let me just do a little advertisement for the fourth of these webinars, which will now take place on Thursday, the 10th of December, 9 AM Greenwich Mean Time. It's being given by Piers Dunstan of CSIRO, who's based in Tasmania in Australia. Hope if it's of interest you will tune into that one. But thank you everybody for your very good stimulating questions. Thank you all the BirdLife team. Really, really good. Take care, keep well everybody, and see you hopefully on the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, David and GOBI team, and thanks for everyone for watching. Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.